Well, thank you, Yusuf. This has been very enjoyable this evening. Again, remember in my opening statement I said I would be defending two major contentions this evening. First, there are good reasons for holding that Jesus died by crucifixion, and second, there are no good reasons for denying it. So I just want to kind of wrap this up. I presented 6 reasons. Now, the only ones of that 6 that I need to address is the early one, because Yusuf hasn't responded to those others after my rebuttals. The early, he came back in his second rebuttal here and said that the Gospels were unknown to Paul and because they hadn't yet been written. That's right. That just shows how early this was. And here he is talking about how the Gospels had legend and stuff in it. Well, I'm giving him the earliest information, and he doesn't seem to like that either because it doesn't agree with the legendary stuff later on. I don't get that. The Gospels were based on the traditions about Jesus, but Paul got his information from the eyewitnesses who would later form this tradition. So again, it's pre-Pauline, which means it's very early. He still didn't answer my 6th argument, too, about the Jesus was a prophet who prophesied his death. If he actually died by crucifixion, then Islam is a false religion. If he died by, if Jesus did not die by crucifixion, Christianity is a false religion. If Jesus died by crucifixion, Islam is a false religion. Now, about some of the arguments he gave on the other side here about arguments to deny Jesus' death by crucifixion, he said that Jesus tells Mary not to touch him because he had not yet ascended, so he wasn't dead. Well, take it within the context. Stop committing the cherry-picking foul. Ladies and gentlemen, there's enough cherries being delivered here this evening. I hope you like them because there's enough to go around for everyone. When you look at the statement here in the context, this is immediately after the angels said that Jesus has been raised from the dead. So if you're going to take this thing about Jesus saying, I haven't ascended to my Father yet, why are you going to accept that but not the proclamation of the angels that he's been raised from the dead? Now, the one I did forget that I didn't see in my last one that I couldn't make out is that when Jesus died, he wants to know from me when Jesus died, and he said he didn't like my argument that, well, you tell me when Surah 4 was written. He says that's a poor argument. I agree. I'm giving it to show the ridiculousness of his argument there. It doesn't really apply. Okay, he says there's an issue with did Jesus die? Did he rise? No, this isn't an issue. I showed how we can deal with these separately. I checked with Johan a little bit just before the debate, and he confirmed that he sent an email to Yusuf confirming that this is what the topic of tonight's debate was going to be on, Jesus' death by crucifixion. The natural versus the spiritual body, and he says, look, the disciples thought that this was a spirit. Why would they think it was a spirit? They thought Jesus was dead, but he appeared to them in body. No, that would have been a resurrection body. Every single account that mentions this, like Luke, like Matthew, like Mark, like John, like Paul, they talk about the bodily resurrection of Jesus. And in 1 Corinthians 15:44, that it's sown a natural body and raised a spiritual body. I looked through all the extant Greek literature from the 8th century BC through the 3rd century. That's 1,100 years, 11 centuries. There are 846 occurrences of the term psychikos, which means natural. There are 1,130, I think, occurrences of the term pneumatikos for spiritual. Psychikos does not mean physical. He was right in saying it's natural. So it's not a contrast between physical and spiritual, material versus immaterial. That's not what Paul's saying here. He uses the term a little bit earlier, the same two terms in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 14 and 15. Again, a few chapters earlier in 15 here, where Paul says the natural man doesn't understand the things of the Spirit, for they are spiritually discerned. In other words, it's kind of like Paul is giving out free T-shirts to the members of the church at Corinth saying, the wisdom of God here, and then when you look on the other side, it says, you wouldn't understand, it's a spiritual thing. So that's what's going on here. It's not, again, comparing the material with the immaterial. That's a misreading of the text. So it looks like I've answered all of them here. I appreciate your attention this evening and you guys sitting through this. But I think it has become abundantly clear where the evidence points. Jesus died by crucifixion in the 1st century. But I do want to say, since Yusuf does want to deal with the resurrection, I will say this. It didn't end there. There's some really good news. Jesus did rise from the dead. And I'll wait, because I'll wait around for 30 minutes, and if Yusuf wants to debate on it, I will be here. Thank you.
Yusuf's closing statement.
Thank you, Mike, and it's been great having this debate this evening. I really enjoyed it. I just want to start by saying that it is true that Muslims are indeed Muslims due to the Quran, and there would have been no Muslim-Christian debate without the Quran. It's also true that Muslims have become interested in denying that Jesus died by crucifixion on the basis of Surah 4 verse 157. But if this verse did not exist, and if the Quran did not deny the crucifixion, and if the Quran asserted that Jesus died without specifying that he died by crucifixion, I would still debate, Mike, on whether or not Jesus really died at the time that the Gospels say that he did. And not quite interestingly, he hasn't given us up to now exactly when Jesus died, and he's bringing up a whole lot of other red herrings. For even in that case, he could have survived the cross and died later. The question by his death is raised not only by the Quran, but by the claim that he was raised from the dead, and by the failure of the Gospels to present convincing evidence that Jesus was really dead to begin with. And it's not a question of, I understand we might have had a miscommunication, I accepted email communication, but it's Paul that has compounded the problem. Paul made the resurrection of Jesus from the dead the crux of Christianity. For him, everything stands or falls on one question: did Jesus really rise from the dead? Paul, however, declared that Jesus died as a curse for us, which means he is admitting that Jesus died under the curse of God. Now, if Jesus died under the curse of God, what reason do we have to believe that God would vindicate a person who died under his curse? None. Atheists have no reason to believe this, because they start with the hypothesis that there would be no God to vindicate the accursed persons. Believers have no reason to suppose that God would want to vindicate a person who was under his curse. If anyone says, as Mike had just concluded, that the accursed person actually rose and came back to life after he was once dead and he was vindicated by God, we should be prepared to examine the records of the extraordinary event and not just simply say, well, that's not the discussion. It is intertwined. I made specific reference to Raymond Brown, who in his 2-volume work, The Death of the Messiah, writes that crucifixion pierces no vital organs. We must therefore wonder, what was the physiological death or cause of the death of Jesus? Mike hasn't dealt with this issue. Moreover, Brown notes that Mark's Gospel, the earliest of the 4, indicated that there was some doubt on the part of the Roman governor Pilate that Jesus could have died at that time, when the Gospels indicate to the time of his death. Again, Mike has not dealt with this particular issue accordingly. Brown points out that Matthew and Luke both rewrite the episode in their own Gospels in such a way as to omit mention that Pilate had that particular doubt. Mike has not dealt with that. The obvious reason for rewriting, according to Brown, is that the readers of Mark's Gospel would start entertaining the same doubt that Pilate had, and Matthew and Luke wanted their own particular Gospels not to encourage that particular doubt. Now, on all these points, Mike hasn't dealt with any of these issues. I want to conclude on something positive. And I'll give you a quotation by Gregory Boyd, who posits a whole host of difficulties that plague the penal substitutionary view. And he says, how are we to understand sin and guilt literally being transferred from a guilty person to an innocent person, or to animals with the Old Testament sacrifices? What sort of justice is it that punishes an innocent person for what another person did? How are we to reconcile the idea that the Father needs to exact payment from or on behalf of his enemies with Jesus' teaching and example that we are to love unconditionally and forgive without demanding payment? Along the same lines, how do we reconcile the idea that God cannot be reconciled with sinners without his wrath being satisfied with blood, with a pervasive scriptural description of God forgiving people? Again, who died on the cross? Why could God have not chosen an innocent man to pay the price? To which many people will say, it's not a perfect sacrifice. It's not a perfect sacrifice. God had to come down and die for the sins of mankind. To which I then always ask, do you then literally mean that God died? Because if that was the case, then who would look after the affairs of the world? And they would say, no, that is not the case. God didn't die, but then we're back to square one. Was it the man? Was it the God? What was the actual deal? How is the view that God requires a kill to have his rage placated essentially different from the pagan or magical understanding of divine appeasement found in primordial religion throughout history? So having exercised our reason, we should not neglect our faith. The Muslim belief is that it was God's will to save Jesus instead of letting him die at the hands of his enemies. The person of the greatest power and influence in this was God himself. He has the power to influence the minds of people, and God should surely have given Jesus the endurance to live through the pain being affixed to a cross. I'd like to end with a scriptural quotation. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. The Son shall not bear the iniquity of the Father, neither shall the Father bear the iniquity of the Son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon him, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon him. But if the wicked will turn from all the evil and do that which is lawful and right, he shall surely live. He shall not die. That is Islam. You pay for your sins, and I pay for my sins. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, there's going to be an opportunity now to ask a couple of questions. Now, because we're running a little bit late, it's not going to be a very long Q&A, but I want everybody that wants to ask a question to Yusuf to line up at the microphone on that side, and you've got a question for Mike, you line up on that mic. No pun